So remember his last question. Remember he asked a question about, according to my characteristics, 5 characteristics, doesn't 15th century Castile fit into the same pattern? And the answer is, he knows a lot more about 15th century Castile than I do. So whatever I'm going to say, he's going to show me that I missed something. But let me put it this way. I think some of the characteristics are very interesting and perhaps suggest something unique about the 15th century in Spain. And I think that's important to talk about. I think the first thing, his question raises, how good is periodization? And can you really make a general rule about anything and not have exceptions? And of course, as I suggested from the start, it's very tentative, it can be challenged, it doesn't work properly. I mean, I've been criticized for all kinds of other reasons, as you will see as we go along. And certainly it's part of a larger question, but I think Castile may in fact be unique, that in the Middle Ages, many of the processes that I described were actually happening already. So that, you know, to use the Hebrew, the biblical expression, which I'll translate, Ein kol chadash tachat hashemesh, there's nothing new under the sun. You know, that's from Kohelet, right? It's from Ecclesiastes. So you can find, you know, the medievalists. I remember giving a lecture before the medievalists who essentially argued with me about every point here. It seems to me what is most interesting about 15th century Spain is a strong Jewish community, which takes care of itself, the juderia. The issue of mingle identities is very interesting because you have a Jewish community living side by side a converso community. Are they mingled though, or are they separate? I mean, they're obviously interconnecting with each other, but it's not exactly the same kind of social mixing that I'm talking about later on. There are books published, you're right, so you pointed that out. On the other hand, the real explosion of knowledge takes place later. Even though we have, you know, a group of books that were published before 1500, the real impact of the printing press is much later, everywhere. So to speak about a knowledge explosion may be an exaggeration. In fact, I don't know enough about the history of they were mostly published in Portugal, right? Not in Spain. In Spain too, before 1492. So, I mean, that's a very interesting question to raise about the import of these books, why they were published, who read them, what was the readership, and so on. Has anyone done any work on that?
No. There is a single article by Joshua Bloch, published in the New York.
Joshua Bloch, right.
Ever since, there is nothing, there is almost no material for dealing with the problem.
Right.
The connection that you have between printing house, Hebrew printing house, and yeshiva audience and public for this consumption public for these books. I think this is very interesting because the three of the 4 printing houses, Hebrew printing houses in Spain, are connected at some point with
yeshiva.
Who is in the
So I used the word precocious. I mean, it took a while before people realized the impact of print. The book that I'd like to talk about.
There is a rabbi, Abraham Saba.
Yeah.
Before 1490.
Yes, Abraham Saba. Yeah.
About the importance of
print already. All right. So this is really very interesting. Obviously the question of mobility is after. I mean, we're still speaking about a basic community living in a certain area, and of course it is a community. I don't know, it's certainly going through trauma. It's going through, that famous article called "Trauma in Tortosa" by Frank Talmadge. So in some respects it shares some of the commonalities of what I'm speaking about. But I think it's a matter of scale is the answer. In other words, I think that when I speak about the Jewish community at the end of the 16th and 17th century, I'm speaking about a much larger thing, as you will see. and a kind of a phenomenon of new communities that have been established, that are developing new styles of organization and leadership and so on. So obviously I'm focusing on the differences, but there are also continuities. So I think it's really helpful that you point this out. I still like to learn more about Castile as a community not in decline. I mean, being a student of Beinart, so I learned there's first is 1391, the first crisis, the second crisis is 1412, and then of course by the middle of the 15th century, a third of the Jewish population are converts, and then the Inquisition, and then expulsion. So there's a different history here, right? Obviously, than that history. And I really, need to know more. But I'm glad he raised the question. So don't take everything I say seriously. That's the bottom line. And when I have, a Jewish historian sitting here that knows a lot, he's going to criticize me. So that's okay. All right. So now I want to present today the two of the first 5 factors, and to give you an overview of each. Again, I have to be very general because we don't have enough time, but I want to give you a little bit more than I gave you last time on each, and to raise certain questions about the whole issue of mobility. I have here, I'm not going to read it obviously, I just was at the Renaissance Society for America, their annual conference, and they had a panel on mobility in early modern Europe, general mobility. And they asked me to speak about Jews and mobility. Jews on the move, I call it. Jews on the move. So I actually just gave a paper about 2 or 3 weeks ago, but I'm not going to read that paper. Let me just raise a few questions. So, I think I used the word last time. Jews are always on the move, right? I mean, that's the history of Judaism, right? From 586 BCE to 70 AD. Jews create a diaspora, a Jewish community outside of Israel, and they are constantly on the move. We also, I think somebody wants to come in, no? Hello. Tell me your name again.
Sonia.
Sonia's here, okay, great. And we have this theme, which is both a theological and an historical theme of the Juif errant. You gave me the Spanish translation of that last time.
Judío errante.
All right. Judío errante, right. So it's the same thing, the Juif errant. So why do I say it in French then?
You prefer French?
Yeah, no, and Richard Cohn did a big exhibit on the Juif errant in the Paris Museum a couple of years ago. And there's also a plant called the Juif errant.
There is an opera.
There's also an opera called, that's called the Juif errant. You're using the intercom, okay. I see. All right. Instant knowledge. And of course, the theme plays itself out in Jewish history. In fact, I don't know if you know a historian or a sociologist, really, named Werner Zumbart. Did you ever come across his name? In 1911, if I'm not mistaken, and you'll check me if I'm wrong, he wrote a book called The Jews and Capitalism. He was a student of Max Weber, and Weber had written on the Protestant ethic and its role in capitalism, in the rise of capitalism. So he expanded the idea that Jews, too, were the authors of capitalism. Later on, it was used by the Nazis against the Jews. It became a kind of anti-Semitic work. But Zumbart wasn't necessarily an anti-Semite. If you read the book, one whole long part of the book deals with wandering, the wandering Jew. So for him, this is a quality which allowed the Jew to become a good capitalist. They had contacts all over the world, their networks were all over the place, and Jews moved from place to place, but they all spoke Hebrew so they could communicate with each other, and so on. So this theme has been played out a lot in Jewish history in general, okay? That's the first thing. But clearly, what I want to argue here is that there is something very, very special about this period where mobility is a major factor. I want to speak about two different kinds of mobility, and then I want to speak about actually a third. The first mobility is mobility brought about by expulsion. Groups, entire groups, populations having to move because of an edict of throwing them out. And of course, here the most important example is 1492 of Spain, but Portugal and a whole group of local expulsions that go on throughout the 16th century, in Italy, in Germany, and elsewhere, which brings about major movements of Jews. Okay? The second I want to speak about is individual mobility. And you must, in this we need to put the Jew into a larger pattern, because this is also a very mobile period for all cultures. The discovery of the New World, colonization of South America, Central America, Brazil, and so on and so forth. Large communities of people being exported, slave populations later on. But also the mobility within Europe itself. And here we can speak about movements from country to city, or city to country. In other words, all kinds of internal mobilities going on. Or we can speak about the itinerant scholar moving from city to city, studying. The intellectual journey, which also becomes a part of early modern culture as well. Individuals who travel to learn, to know something about the world and so on. In other words, mobility and of course better transportation systems, particularly the boat, which is critical, right? And we can speak in the 19th century about the train, but the boat is clearly important here as well. So the movement of peoples, the movement between Africa and Italy, for example, or Spain, and of course the great discoveries, which of course create then a new other for the European culture, a new awareness of other peoples, of an expanding globe, and what this means in terms of, so who are we? Who are we Spaniards? Who are we Portuguese? Who are we in relationship to them? We and them, we and the other, and so on. So in other words, you need to put the Jews in the context of all of this. But given that, we have individual movement, an incredible movement of Jews who travel not just because they're expelled, but because of economic reasons, social reasons, intellectual reasons, ideological reasons, going to live in Israel, for example, all kinds of reasons. And we also find within the life of individuals movement. In other words, they're not simply staying in one place, but they move from place to place. And this brings me to the third aspect of mobility that I want to speak about, which is related to the second. And that is, it's a very difficult kind of mobility to really define precisely. I want to call it intellectual mobility. In other words, here I want to hazard an argument that intellectuals especially are on the move. That if you were to look, and here actually in my book what you have, I have about 100 examples. I mean, I could give you more, but I take 100 key intellectual cultural figures from the beginning of the 16th century through the 17th and 18th century, and you could go, of course, into the 19th, 20th century even more. We have in the 20th century, of course, the figure which has been written about of the refugee scholar. Here I'm speaking about, because of the Holocaust, lots of Jewish intellectuals were uprooted, either in the 1930s, before the Holocaust, or those who survived the Holocaust. In America, for example, in the 20th century, many of the rabbinical seminaries were filled with refugees. I myself studied with several who had been refugees, who came, who were offered positions because they had nothing. Many of the first Israeli scholars who came to Israel escaped the Holocaust. So refugee scholar is a very interesting phenomenon here. We have a similar kind of phenomenon in the 16th and 17th century. But if you were to look and to chart, it is an extraordinary mobility. Either for economic reasons or social reasons, or simply these people don't acclimate to the world they live in. Now the question is, does mobility create intellectual innovation or stagnation? I mean, when you move, do you become more aware of other people? In other words, my coming to Spain, does that make me a better scholar?
Of
You know,
course.
of course, obvious, right? As in the case, I mean, I was in Budapest for a month in January, February, so I can't speak a word of Hungarian. I mean, I can hardly speak Spanish, but Hungarian is ridiculous. I couldn't speak a word. I could say angalul, that means English. Goulash, I could say, goulash, yeah. I was with a Spanish scholar named Karsten Wilke, who took me around, but he didn't know Hungarian either. So it was difficult. But I hung out in an American university called the Central European University. And there are students from all over Eastern Europe who speak, they speak English there. So I was in my little English ghetto. So there, did Hungary expand my horizons, or did it make me more enclosed into my own world? And the reason I mention myself here as an example is both are possible. In other words, if you chart the intellectual migration of scholars, in many respects, their world is expanded. And here I want to give you the example of one of the articles that I suggested to read, but I don't think you're going to read it, by Moshe Idel. You looked at it?
Yes.
Kol hakavod, as we say in Hebrew. Wow, all right, excuse me. So Idel there speaks about Kabbalah and mobility. What is his argument there? Can you tell me a little bit about the article?
Yeah, that in the 16th century, due to the mobility of Kabbalistic schools, they influenced each other, and they were like in competition with each other, and they developed different characteristics depending on the place where they developed it, in Italy or Safed or in
Good.
other places.
Now, I don't know if you appreciate this. Maybe Javier Katya will. The article, if you know Idel well, you know that he's polemicizing with who? Sholem, Gershon Sholem. Can you figure out, Sonia, what he's arguing
not
about?
exactly.
No. So Gershon Sholem's view of the history of the Kabbalah in the 16th century is that ultimately it is a reaction to a trauma, to a crisis. And the crisis is the crisis of 1492. The Jews were expelled. Where was God? Why didn't you protect us? What is the meaning of Jewish life after 1492? It's interesting, when Sholem presented, Sholem was of course the great scholar of the Kabbalah at the Hebrew University. When he presented his first lectures on the Kabbalah, he did so which in a series of lectures which eventually became his most famous book, Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism. They were given in 1941 in the Jewish Institute of Religion in New York. 41 was in the middle of the Nazi genocide. The question was already being asked. There's no question that Holocaust plays a role in his historiography. 1492 looks like 1941, 42, 43, 44, in the sense that Jews are asking themselves, what is the meaning of the future? Where are we to go here? How are we to survive? How are we to have faith? So his understanding is that 1492 generates slowly, it takes a long time to generate it, the Kabbalah of Isaac Luria in Sfat, in Safed in Israel. Now Luria, of course, appears in the 1560s. There's a gap here of 60, 70 years. That's a long time to react to 1492. But nevertheless, Lurianic Kabbalah is a response to the trauma, right? That's Sholem. Lurianic Kabbalah is an attempt to say we must gather all of the sparks, nitzutzot in Hebrew. We must fight evil, overcome evil through a process called tikkun. So, in some respects, his understanding of the Kabbalah in the 16th century is a kind of post-Holocaust response. Okay, it's a parallel. Does he say so explicitly? No, but it's implied. Now what is Edel doing? Edel is offering a different model. Instead of trauma, mobility. In other words, he doesn't want to understand the emergence of the Kabbalah in terms of one trauma, 1492. By the way, another historian who was very influenced by this model, I mean, this was the prevalent view of studying Jewish history. It comes very much out of Israel and Zionism. Chaim Beinart, Yitzchak Beer, Yosef Yerushalmi, all of them see 1492 as a critical moment in Jewish history for a variety of reasons, right? So Sholem was writing within this context, there's no question about it, and Sholem was part of that Jerusalem school. Yerushalmi, when he wrote his work on a series of historical works written in this period, many of them coming out of Spain, Shevet Yehuda, Ibn Verga, Samuel Ushque, and so on. He also saw 1492 as the critical moment, the critical trauma. It changed everything. But Edel is not part of that world. In other words, the history has changed, and Edel now wants to talk about mobility. So mobility, so what does it mean? It means that the issue is not so much the crisis, but what happens when migrants come, when Spanish Kabbalists come to Italy. In Italy there had been people studying the Kabbalah, but it was a very different school of Kabbalah. And it was an oral tradition of Kabbalah. The Spanish Kabbalists come in the end of 1492, and they encounter a totally different world. So there is a clash. There is an encounter between these two schools of Kabbalah. The same thing happens in the Ottoman Empire, and the same thing happens in the land of Israel. So what he's suggesting is that mobility, therefore, for the history of the Kabbalah, of Kabbalistic thought, transforms the way we think about the Kabbalah, and new Kabbalistic schools emerge as you argue. Now, what I want to suggest is that let's enlarge this discussion beyond Kabbalah, to talk about all of Jewish cultural creativity, and to argue that in some respects, mobility can make people more alert, more aware, and have them think and be innovative. On the other hand, mobility can also create enclaves. You go to, I'm trying to think of examples from Spain, but when all the Argentinians came to Madrid or to Barcelona, did they hang out together? Mm-hmm. They don't hang out with the rest of the Spaniards, do they? They create their own little cultural enclave. That's what immigrants do. They come to their own place. So in New York we have Little Italy. In Los Angeles and in we have Mexican part of the town where they all speak Spanish, or San Diego and so on in California. Essentially they create their own enclaves. Russian Jews who came to Israel or to America hang out among themselves and speak Russian, and so on and so forth. So what you have then is a conservatism, an attempt to hold on to the old life of the past, to think only in the terms of the past. And of course this is extremely relevant in terms of language, all right? Well, we referred to this last week, now I want to expand upon it. Spanish comes with the immigrants to the Ottoman Empire and they continue to speak Spanish. And they eventually develop their own dialogue and that becomes Ladino. But nevertheless, when you speak your own language in an area which is Ottoman, when you don't learn Turkish or you are reluctant to learn Turkish, you are clearly living in the past. So it is not innovation, but it is conservatism. So, in other words, mobility is a very important factor, but it can transform culture. It can also create, essentially, a return or an attempt to look back at the past as the golden age, and you sort of ignore. What happens in Israel with the various Kabbalistic schools, to follow out Edel's argument, is both conservatism and innovation. In other words, it depends on the individuals we're speaking about. And also, mobility involves challenges. It involves, I don't want to use the word trauma again, but it involves pain and hardship and suffering. When you move and you take your family with you and you have to struggle to end in a new world and so on, these are traumatic moments, and they're reflected in all kinds of ways. And what this does as well is create not only one enclave, but many enclaves. In other words, if there are immigrants that are moving in all different places, they create essentially cities where there are different kinds of Jews or different kinds of Jewish communities. And this creates tension. It creates a sense of difference. The social mixing is not always easy. Sometimes it creates tremendous controversy. The good example of this is Italy, and the controversies that are going on between Ashkenazic and Sephardic and Italian Jews. Italian Jews who had been living there already, Sephardic Jews who came in 1492, and then Sephardic Jews, conversos who came later on, and Jews coming down from Provence, and then Ashkenazic Jews who came down from Germany. And all of them are living in one place. We talked about this last week. They are trying to understand each other. But to give you one very concrete example, there are the issue of who is the rabbi. This has been discussed by Reuven Bonfil in the 16th century in Italy. There's an Ashkenazic model and there's a Sephardic model. And they were different, and they saw themselves different. And the rabbis argued with each other. We have these extraordinary controversies between rabbis in 16th century Italy. And it really breaks down into ethnic differences between these communities and the way they perceived of the leadership of the rabbi. So in other words, this mobility creates tensions on all kinds of levels. And it creates new configurations, but it also creates resistance. All of this is characteristic of the period that we're speaking about. Now, let us just chart out the larger picture before we go on. So we are speaking about expulsion from Spain, Portugal, local expulsions, as we said. We're speaking about the movement of two extraordinary populations eastward, and the creation simultaneously of two very large and significant communities. The Jewish community in the Ottoman Empire and the Jewish community in Eastern Europe, Poland, Lithuania. In the latter case, the process is very slow. It begins before 1492, way before. It begins in the 14th century with the movement of essentially Central European Jews moving slowly eastward. As conditions become difficult, they follow a kind of frontier where there are better economic and political conditions for them. By the 15th century, there are Jews populating the area of what is Poland, Lithuania, and by the 16th century, it reaches its crescendo. The Ottoman Empire, of course, the major impetus is 1492. Although there are Jews living in, there had been Jews living in, Romanian Jews and others living in the Ottoman Empire prior, quickly over a generation or two, Jews coming from Spain and Portugal are dominating this area and take over essentially the entire Jewish community. What is interesting is the parallel between Poland, Lithuania, and Spain. Basically, Jews in both countries perform a colonizing function. That is, they are invited by the governments and offered economic opportunities unavailable to them elsewhere to play an important role in the economic and social life of the community. In other words, they are encouraged. Here, and this will come up in our second discussion of the community, is the very important role that governments play. In other words, in shaping policies that invite Jews to settle in their area. So we are speaking about Jews are no longer restricted as moneylenders. They are tax collectors. They are performing all kinds of functions for either the Polish king or local Polish nobility. And within the Ottoman context, a similar thing in the various cities of the Ottoman Empire and so on. Out of this will come a Jewish community, which we'll talk about more directly in our second hour. But clearly what is going on then is the movement of these two communities. Now, is mobility therefore over by the time these two communities are established? And the answer is no. That from 1648, the Khmelnytsky pogroms, a very series of killings that go on and assaults against Jewish communities in Eastern Europe, we have a movement backwards. In other words, now from east to Central Europe to west, or east to south. Adam Teller is a very fine historian who is now working on a history of these, of the mobility of these refugees from the Khmelnytsky crisis, for example. And what is very interesting is that the Jewish communities, they move southward, they move westward, and they now return after several centuries to the area of what is Germany or the Holy Roman Empire, and they eventually come, by this time, the Jewish community, well, we haven't spoken about the conversos yet, we will. The conversos have created a very important center in Amsterdam and Hamburg, elsewhere. They move back into these areas where they had not been living. So, for example, for Jonathan Israel, this is the beginning of early modernity because it means the resettlement of the West. That's mercantilism, right? Now, all of a sudden, the Western governments are willing to take these people back in, and all of a sudden we have large numbers of Eastern European Jews moving back into Central Europe and even into Amsterdam. So we have refugees, Ashkenazic Jews, now making their reappearance in the West. So in other words, the 16th century is a movement westward, eastward, and now we have in the 17th century a movement westward. So in other words, mobility is still playing itself out in various forms. Now superimposed upon this is the mobility of the conversos. All right? So here now we are speaking about originally a large migration of conversos leaving the Iberian Peninsula from the middle of the 16th into the late 16th century, and the creation of a converso diaspora in Amsterdam, in Hamburg, in Livorno. We spoke about these very briefly also last time. And later on, the movement of the diaspora continues. So from Amsterdam to London, from London to Curacao, to Recife, to parts of the New World, and a converso diaspora which also enters the Mediterranean. So in a place like Smyrna, for example, there was a large population of converso merchants. So we are talking again now about a network, primarily an economic network of merchants who are settling all over the place. The mother country, the homeland is Amsterdam in many respects. In other words, and we will see Amsterdam as a model of institutional converso Jewish life. Amsterdam becomes the model. I mean, if you're not, if you've been to the synagogue in Amsterdam, have you ever seen the Sephardic synagogue in Amsterdam? No, you don't travel from Spain to Amsterdam. I traveled to for America to Amsterdam. You don't travel to Spain from Amsterdam. So nobody, you've never been to Amsterdam? Wow.
Yes.
Oh, you've been. But you didn't see the Sephardic synagogue. Oh, how could you miss it? It's so big, it's enormous. But if you go there, then you go to London. You've been to London too?
Yes.
So go to the Bevis Mark synagogue.
Yes.
And the synagogue looks identical. It's identical. And in Curacao also, the synagogue looks the same. And in New York, the Sephardic synagogue, of course. In the 90s, you probably davened there, right?
It's a new building, but still
resembles the old Amsterdam synagogue. So you see, and not only that, I mean, they're not only networks of merchants. They're who's the woman that wrote on the French woman who wrote on the networks of rabbis. In other words, there was a Evelyn Oliel Graus, right? Exactly. The networks of a rabbi. In other words, the first major modern rabbinical seminary is, she argues, in Amsterdam. And all of these Sephardic rabbis are trained to go abroad, to go to Curacao, to go to Recife, and so on and so forth. So we have here, therefore, mobility of conversos, mobility of Ashkenazic Jews, creation of new communities throughout this period, and of course intellectual migration, the movement of individuals for personal reasons and so on and so forth. Now, given now we haven't spoken very much about Italy. Italy, of course, Italy is also a movement within. In other words, from the beginning of this period, most Jews are living in the south around Rome, and there is a movement therefore into northern Italy. So communities like Mantova, Ferrara, Padova. These are communities that are created that become important from the end of the 15th century on. And they are made up, as I said, of multiple populations. Venezia, of course, the Veneto region, and so on. And what happens also, I sort of left this piece out. As I said, Ashkenazic Jews make their way back into Central Europe. We also have Ottoman Jews also going back into Italy. In other words, there is movement back and forth. Not to the same extent, but nevertheless, there are three identifiable communities in Italy: the Tedeschi, what are the other two? The Levantini and the Ponantini. So the Levantini are the Ottoman Jews. The Ponantini are conversos, basically, are Jews coming from the west. So these three communities are all found in Italy, for example. But not only Italy. Let's take other international communities. Hamburg. Hamburg is made up of Ashkenazic Jews and conversos. The community in the 16th and 17th century, and if you want, your friend will take you on a tour of Hamburg, and you can see the Sephardic cemetery there and how vast it is and how incredible it is, made up of conversos all over the place. Michael Studman Halevi is the expert on the converso cemetery. So you can see Spanish and Portuguese written all over. You can see pictures. I even seen, and you'll say that this can't be true, but I saw gravestones with a cross and a Magen David on the same gravestone. The Star of David. See, if this God won't make it, you can make it with the other one together. So these are converso graves and so on. Hamburg is an international community. Prague is an international community in the 16th, 17th century. Under the court of Rudolf II, there are Sephardic Jews, there are Ashkenazic Jews, there are Jews from all different varieties and shapes and so on living in Prague. Krakow is primarily an Ashkenazic community, but there are also Sephardim there as well. And of course, the most international of all are the Jewish communities in Palestine and Israel. These are international communities made up of immigrants, right? So you have, and sometimes you have tensions between Ashkenazic and Sephardic Jews in Jerusalem, in Sfat, in Safed. So what we are speaking about, therefore, so here my first point I think should be quite clear. Mobility is a major factor in talking about early modernity. Mobility does reshape communities. It establishes new communities. It establishes conservatism and openness and closure. It establishes a whole variety of things. And as I said last time, and I'm repeating myself, but by repeating myself, I hope to reinforce what I'm saying. Jews are meeting other Jews. That's the most interesting characteristic of this period. All right? Can you say the same for 15th century Castile, for example? Not to this extent, right? It's a matter of scale, right? I mean, and Ashkenazi Jews are meeting Sephardic Jews, which is totally new, and we will talk about that also more in terms of book culture as well. When the Sephardic library invades, through the printing press, invades Ashkenazic space, who are these Sephardic rabbis? Why do we have to know about this culture? What is the meaning of this and so on? With the fact that Jews speak many languages. Now, let me talk about language for a second here. So I'm not an expert on the history of Yiddish, and certainly not Ladino. Ladino expert is over there. But it seems to me one can argue that early modernity creates new Jewish languages. These languages have been around for a long time. I mean, the beginnings of Yiddish go back to the late Middle Ages. Italy is, as I said last time, is one of the earliest places, but it obviously Yiddish emerges within Central European German culture, right, and Ashkenazic culture and so on. But Yiddish is propelled by the printing press. Yiddish takes off like crazy because of the printing press. First in Venice, and then in Amsterdam, and then in other parts of Eastern Europe. The hundreds, thousands of books that are published in Yiddish in this period of time create a new cultural mix, which many historians have spoke about. Most eloquently, Shlomo Berger, who teaches at the University of Amsterdam. The Yiddish book is a phenomenon of the early modern period. Yiddish book dealers. The culture of Yiddish is a culture of popular culture. It is a culture which, to put it in crude, chauvinistic, Jewish traditional language, is a culture for young children and women. That's the way it's referred to. We're writing, in other words, for people who are not as educated, because they're not men. But Yiddish soon transforms the male's world. Part of the history of gender in this period has to do, of course, with Yiddish and Yiddish works written for women and so on. And we can speak more about that as well. But Yiddish is not only created, it is diffused. It enters every nook and cranny of a culture now which is expansive from Amsterdam through parts of Eastern Europe, okay, and including northern Italy. So it is an extraordinary large range. In the case of Ladino is later, and it is restricted primarily to the Ottoman region, but there are a lot of Jews there, and the press becomes extremely important. Later on, newspapers. But clearly what we're speaking about, therefore, is the creation of an entire new literature, which I know so little about, but is an area of growth, a new area of scholarship that needs to be studied in great depth because of its significance. In one case, an historian has compared, very late, 19th century Yiddish with 19th century Ladino. I'm speaking about Sarah Stein.
Making Jews modern.
Right, exactly. But the history of Ladino of course, goes back to at least to the 18th century or even earlier. And of course, so it's not exactly the same time I'm speaking about. But nevertheless, I'm speaking about, therefore, the emergence of two new literatures which are clearly accelerated by printing presses. And what is really interesting about both Yiddish and Ladino, they emerge in cultures where the majority culture is not speaking this language. It is a throwback to the past. How can you speak a form of Spanish in a Turkish linguistic zone? Or how can you speak a German, Jewish language in Krakow and in Vilna? I mean, these are cultures that speak different languages, right? But nevertheless, this is the language of Jews. This also suggests that the insularity of the culture, the ability, this brings back the model of the cultural enclave, right? That Jews are able to sort of separate themselves culturally off by speaking in a different language, by writing, by publishing in a different language. Of course, ultimately, Jews become multilingual, right? Polish Jews knew Polish. They had to, to economically function. And certainly Sephardic Jews in the Ottoman Empire knew Turkish, and some even Arabic, but clearly their primary language became, so we have an internal language and an external language. We have a language which we address our own famille, right, and we speak within our own cultural precinct. We speak our own way of addressing each other. And this is very common for diaspora Jews, right? I couldn't get over the phenomenon. I was teaching also in Antwerp, in the Netherlands, in Belgium. So there, Jews, of course, speak, I was going to say Dutch, but I mean Flemish, which is basically the same thing. And of course, they speak English because everybody in Belgium and Holland speak English. But what is the language Jews speak at home? French.
French.
Even when, when you go through Brussels, there are language debates. So below Brussels, everybody speaks French.
Right.
And this has to do with the political, the way the political map was broken off. I can't tell you the political history. But essentially, for example, I taught in Leuven for a semester. So Leuven is north of Brussels, or actually east of Brussels. So in Leuven, they speak only Flemish. But when the university split between the debate between French and, so they created a university, Le Neuf, which is another university south. They took the library and they split it in half. Half went to Leuven and the other half went to Leuven-le-Neuf. And there you only speak French. So my friend Roger Chartier, the French historian, was invited to Leuven and they wouldn't let him speak French. Everybody knew French. But the Jews speak French in their home, which is really interesting. I mean, I was in their Jewish homes and they speak only French. Even if you're in the Flemish zone, you speak French.
So before the south part of Brussels, which was of French influence, was the richest. So French was considered.
Exactly. And of course now, you have in the metro, they have all three languages, but nevertheless, there's still a resistance. You speak French in the French zone. You speak. But what I'm saying is that what we're speaking about already, which is very much a part of the modern era of multilingualism with respect to Jews, is already an early modern phenomenon as well. I mean, Jews can't function without speaking Turkish or Polish, but nevertheless they have their own language. And of course we haven't mentioned Hebrew, which is a language, was it spoken or not? That's a very interesting question. And there are all kinds of debates about that. I know the debates that go on in Italy. My feeling about Italy is that all of the sermons of the rabbis were given in Italian, very early. But they wrote their sermons and published them in Hebrew. Could Italian Jews or could Spanish Jews speak Hebrew? Probably. But did they speak? Probably not so much. The Zionist historians want to make them all Hebrew speakers in the 15th, 16th century. So they spoke the languages. So in this place, Yiddish and Ladino, or Yiddish and Spanish, have become more important for Jewish languages. How are we doing for time? I'm going to stop at 12:30 and then we'll take a break. A few more points I want to make. We have next year an historian named Lucia Raspi. Do you know her? Coming to the center. She's writing a very interesting book about the 16th century, about a genre of literature that emerges called Sifrei Minhagim. And she's finding all kinds of very interesting things. Now, what is a Sefer Minhag? It is a book of customs. It is a book which describes local customs of Jews. Somehow to preserve these customs, they are localized so that they will not be forgotten. What is interesting about these books is that they are illustrated. So this is a very important part of early modern Jewish art. These books have been studied by art historians, even though they couldn't read the Yiddish. They read and they're all in Yiddish, by the way, which is very interesting. Now I can't describe them, but what I think was interesting about them is that Sifrei Minhagim are a reflection of mobility. Localized customs we are forgetting, we are moving, we are being transformed by the new conditions of our life, and therefore publishing these books is an attempt to somehow arrest the newness or arrest the mobility, to somehow recall and refashion what had been local. For those who study the medieval community in Ashkenaz, Minhag is absolutely critical. Critical for understanding of Soloveitchik and all kinds of other historians. Minhag, custom, is a very critical aspect of determining Jewish legal law and life and the behavior of how Jews live. But given the mobility, the accelerated mobility of the early modern period, the books of customs are an attempt somehow to preserve what is being lost. Local customs, local traditions, and so on and so forth, rather than a kind of standardized Judaism and so on. So that's just one interesting example. The other aspect of mobility is the creation of itinerant professions. Now again, you could find some of this in the medieval period. I'm not suggesting it's totally new, but I think these groups are extremely prominent. I speak about peddlers. I speak about book dealers. Book dealers are very important here. I speak about petty merchants. I speak about doctors. I speak about rabbis, chazanim, klei kodesh, in other words, other people that are working within the synagogue and so on. I'm speaking about people that are extremely mobile and move from place to place. I can tell you, being the son of a rabbi, that mobility was a factor in all my life. My father moved from congregation to congregation. He went from one bad congregation to another bad congregation and so on. Now, of course, I'm talking about myself, and we're talking about the 16th century, so that's ridiculous. But clearly, rabbis the rabbinate is a mobile profession. Take a look at Chabad, for example. You know Chabad. You have Chabad here in Madrid. You know what Chabad is? Lubavitch rabbi, the Hasidim. So they're what's called, one of the most interesting phenomenon, which actually your friend Matis Lehman is studying, is shluchim. That is emissaries who come from the land of Israel and travel all over the place. They're moving from place to place to place. Why? Basically to raise money. They're schnorrers. They're basically fundraisers, which is also a very noble Jewish profession.
He gave a lecture about that.
About them right here, okay.
About shluchim.
So you see to what degree my notion of mobility, how this fits in perfectly, right? So the movement, right, Chita, exactly, is the most famous shaliach. But they move from place to place to place. In other words, they are, and they get into trouble. Moshe Hajiz is another one, who takes on the Sabbateans, as we'll see. They get involved with fights and wars and so on. But they are moving from town to town to town to town. In other words, so what I'm speaking about is itinerant professionals. Later on, we have Magidim, or those who are kind of popular preachers. We have them selling their little sermons. We have them selling medicines and selling amulets and selling all kinds of things, right? You have them, I don't want to say, gypsies or other Roma or other, or what I saw in the park, which just blew me away. I mean, because they were all over New York. These guys selling fake pocketbooks from Africa. The Africans in the park. You know what I'm talking about, Sonia?
No.
Here, right?
Here in Madrid, I'm talking
Yeah,
about.
Monterrey. Yeah.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. So picture a Jewish equivalent, a Jewish version of that, all right? Selling, books, but not big books, little books, little books that they recently authored and so on, pamphlets and so on, books of skulot, of magical, medical, this kind of popular medicine and so on. So this is also a function of the mobility that we are describing in this period as well. Finally, and here I just want to strengthen the point. Also, the physician. I mean, we didn't speak about doctors. I will speak about doctors later on when I talk about knowledge explosion. But doctors are a very important factor here. We could speak about doctors from the Inquisition. Javier and I spoke about that a little already. The number of conversos going to Alcalá and Salamanca and so on and graduating as physicians. But I'm speaking about the first university which accepted Jews outside of Spain. Spain accepted conversos, not Jews, in Padova, and later on in other Italian cities, and ultimately in Leiden, where the converso sons of conversos of Jews living in Amsterdam send their sons to study medicine. Yossi Kaplan has written on this as well. And of course universities out through the area. But I'm also speaking about doctors who don't have university degrees. I'm speaking about more popular kinds of doctors who are practicing folk medicine and so on. We have a recent dissertation on them, mostly from the Ashkenazic world, written by a student of Robert Lieberlis at Ben Gurion. I forgot his name. But clearly, medicine and the rabbinate are mobile professions. They move. You move where your business